Welcome to the Climate Justice Q&A with Oregon State Treasurer Tobias Read. Welcome to hundreds of you from all around our great state, from Medford to Bend and Cottage Grove to Beaverton and Portland, Eugene to the Rogue Valley and Hood River and Salem, and all points in between. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Cho Kane, or Jenna, and I'm a volunteer with 350 PDX, a grassroots organization working to bring climate justice to Oregon and a more just world for everyone. 350 PDX is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization and doesn't make political endorsements. Thank you for being here today. We'll be going over some learning goals for this event as a point of focus. You'll also learn how state treasurers can address the climate crisis. We'll hear from 5 key stakeholders from around the state with a message for Treasurer Read. Treasurer Read will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer segment where we'll pose some of the questions submitted by the registrants to this event. We have had over 80 questions submitted. And lastly, we'll go over some proposed next steps after this panel. Now, some important logistics are that please feel free to submit questions to the treasurer through the Q&A button. The chat button is to really address to the tech host any technical challenges or questions for the organizers to the event. Please keep your comments in the chat clear, kind, and respectful. And finally, if you'd like to see closed captioning, click on the CC Live Transcript button. We are recording today's sessions for those who weren't able to join tonight, and we will send it to all who registered for the event. First things first, I wanted to acknowledge that we are standing on the land of the indigenous people with a sovereignty that has never been ceded. We have a responsibility to increase awareness of how we got here, and responsibility to care for the land in all the ways that we can, and to right the wrongs of the past in whatever ways that we are each able. I want to invite you to take a moment of silence to pause, to get here, body, mind, and spirit to this event, and to be open to learning. Again, thank you for being here. By the end of this event today, I'd like us to invite you to listen, to learn, and to identify 2 ways that the State Treasurer's Office controls public assets and investments. Also, look out for 2 ways that the State Treasurer's Office is already having an impact financially on policy affecting climate change. And be able to name 1 effort already underway at the state level. And if you could listen to learn from some of our stakeholder concerns, keeping in mind maybe 2 or 3 that are of statewide concern. There are over 40 co-sponsors to this event today, and who through their collaboration voice the importance of an event like this. We are thankful at 350 PDX to have such co-sponsors who have widely shared information about today's event, and we've had over 225 early registrants. Thank you so much for all your efforts to help educate participants from around the state on the impact of public investments and assets to the well-being of community and the planet. Now I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, who will share some background about the role of the state treasurers on the current climate crisis. Brian Bumley is a certified financial planner specializing in sustainable, responsible, and impact investing. He holds an MBA from the London Business School And before becoming a financial advisor in 2008, he worked for 31 years as a reporter and editor for the Associated Press, stationed in Washington, New York, Tehran, Tokyo, Moscow, Warsaw, London, and Portland. He has been volunteering with a 350 PDX since 2015. Welcome, Brian. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Jenna, and thanks for Treasurer Read for joining us and all the stakeholders and participants that are here. Well, the Fund Divest team at 350 PDX is working with allied groups around the world to stop the flow of money into the fossil fuel industry. We've been in conversations with Treasurer Read and his predecessor, Ted Wheeler, for a number of years. And again, we'd like to thank Treasurer Read for his openness and also for his willingness to do the right thing. When it comes to climate change, however, we all need to do more, all of us. Corporations, including fossil fuel companies, raise money by borrowing from banks or issuing stocks and bonds that are publicly traded. Nearly all public pension funds in the United States and Canada own stocks or bonds from fossil fuel companies. Banks lend money, insurance companies insure these projects and invest in them. Asset managers invest funds. Institutional investors, like the state of Oregon, also invest in them. That means that public money is being invested in fossil fuel companies. Combined state pension funds around the United States control about $4.5 trillion. Oregon's publicly managed assets are valued at $118 billion, of which $80 billion are for the pensions of state workers, including teachers. Oregon's assets are divided into different pots. About 1/4 are invested in publicly traded securities, such as fossil fuel companies, as Enbridge, Duke Energy, ExxonMobil, as well as financial institutions that finance the fossil fuel industry. State treasurers have a great deal of influence as elected public officials. As an ex officio member of the Oregon Investment Council, the Oregon State Treasurer cannot simply order the council to divest from fossil fuels. The treasurer and the council have a fiduciary duty to always act in the best interests of those whom the investments are intended to benefit. That means members of the public who have contributed to the money through taxes, and also past and present state workers who are counting on PERS for their pension. While the state treasurer does not directly control the investment, he or she can make public statements. State treasurers have taken strong stances in regard to the environmental, financial, and societal risks posed by fossil fuel investments. Under federal rules, shareholders may propose and vote on resolutions designed to govern corporate behavior. They also vote for members of corporate boards of directors. We've seen state treasurers from Oregon and elsewhere vote the shares they control in ways intended to curb climate change and also promote good corporate governance. We thank Treasurer Read for the principled stance he has taken. A great deal of information can be found on the Oregon State Treasury website. The statement on this slide, which I'll let you read, was in a recent email from the Treasurer in support of sustainable investing, which is also known as environmental, social, and governance investing. Treasurer Read is working with 350 PDX on a range of resolution and director votes related to climate change in the current 2021 annual general meeting cycle. In the last few days, we've received word that a proposal sponsored by Treasurer Read requiring the private present company GEO to disclose its political contributions. Support for that resolution jumped from 44% of shareholders to 66% over 1 year. That's a phenomenal result. Congratulations, and thank you, Treasurer Read. So to recap, State treasurers can make public statements. They can vote shares at annual general meetings and divest. So what about divestment? Socially responsible investors have been debating the merits of holding and voting shares in fossil fuel companies versus selling all those assets, that is, divesting. The long-term goal of divesting is to deprive the fossil fuel companies of the money they need. That's a tall order given their vast cash reserves. But as we'll see, political pressure and the market itself are having an impact. Climate activists often hear that money managers cannot divest because of their fiduciary responsibilities. Here's one definition of those responsibilities, drawn from the Oregon State Treasury website. But here's the deal. Portfolios that do not contain fossil fuel company stocks have been performing better on the broad market for a number of years. We've seen a sharp drop in the stock prices of oil, gas, and coal companies recently. This slide shows two studies with portfolios without fossil fuels that performed better than identical portfolios identical portfolios that included fossil fuels. These are not isolated analyses. So you can see in the one study, a fossil fuel, that's fine. One study, a fossil fuel free portfolio had a positive result, whereas the portfolio with fossil fuels had a negative result. And this graph tells a similar story. From November 2010 through this March, portfolios that did not contain fossil fuels, the blue line, performed better than those that did contain fossil fuel stocks. So those money managers who divested from fossil fuels were demonstrating a higher level of fiduciary duty than those who remain invested in oil, natural gas, and coal stocks. I ran comparisons of different indices, and I came up with the same result over and over. It's shown in this slide. Now, an argument can be made that fossil fuel stocks might rebound, that the lines we see in that graph could reverse. But is that a realistic prospect in the long run? President Biden is recommitting to the 2015 Paris Accord to hold global warming to a 2-degree increase. In the past couple of weeks, he's also pledged to cut US greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. Additionally, he's proposed legislation and is taking executive action to channel billions of dollars into renewable energy in a post-carbon economy. All of these facts are prompting the managers of public pension funds to examine how they might divest from fossil fuels and still meet their fiduciary responsibilities. The managers of the New York City Teachers and Public Employees Fund asked the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, whether their financial returns would suffer if they divested. BlackRock concluded that for fossil fuel-free portfolios, there was not evidence of a significant impact on investment performance. We've seen the same evidence for that in previous slides. The managers of an increasing number of institutional and public investment funds are divesting. Notably, New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli announced plans last December to divest his state's retirement fund, valued at $226 billion. So the question we put to all of you is this: where does Oregon go from here? Thank you.
Brian, thank you so much for that informative presentation. We will now hear from our group of stakeholders from around the state. Each speaker will have 2 to 3 minutes to address the State Treasurer, beginning with Susie Kassouf.
Hi, I think that the host needs to start my video for me.
Okay, thanks so much, Susie.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm so happy to be here. My name's Susanna Kassouf, and I'm a social studies teacher at Grant High School in Portland. Because my students' future so highly depends on whether or not we take bold action on the climate crisis, I feel it is my responsibility to teach it in the classroom. The thing is, my students don't need any more education about a perilous future. They have been living it. Most of them, 9th graders, have resigned themselves to a future of chaos and destruction. They have been hearing about the climate crisis since they were in kindergarten, and each year they watch as their elected officials continue to do nothing to prevent this dystopian future. So I believe it is my role as their teacher to not only educate them about the crisis, but to inspire a sense of hope that not all is lost, that we can still prevent the worst of this crisis, and we can revolutionize our society away from fossil fuels and towards climate resilience. Hope can only come from action. And though COVID-19 interrupted its progress, the movement for climate justice has been exponentially growing in size and power, and my students are learning how to be a part of it. We know that we can no longer continue on a path of business as usual while this business of economic growth robs us of our right to a healthy and habitable planet. So while I deeply appreciate my job as a teacher, I cannot, in good conscience, go on contributing to a retirement fund that chooses to invest in fossil fuels instead of my students' future. Our state has $118 billion to invest, and not one penny of that should be invested in an industry that is actively destroying the planet, our communities, and the future of our young people. Divestment from fossil fuels is one of the most powerful tools we have to crumble the industries that are causing and profiting off of the climate crisis. We all have a responsibility to protect our kids, to protect ourselves, and to protect this planet. Treasurer Read, use your authority as our state treasurer to divest Oregon from fossil fuels. Oregon's young people, our communities, and our entire state depend on you. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Mike Powers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Powers, and I am president of SEIU 503. We are a labor union. We represent around 72,000 workers all over Oregon. These essential employees do all kinds of things for the people of this great state, including home care, nursing care, water quality protection, food safety, highway care, firefighting, janitorial services, adult and child social services, and just all kinds of other things as well. Today, climate change and climate justice are high priorities for our members, both here in Oregon and throughout the nation. We actively work with partners to change how we invest in infrastructure, communities, and people for a future that works for all of us. I want to thank 350 PDX for putting together this event with Treasurer Read to discuss how climate change and climate justice should influence state investments. I also want to thank Treasurer Read and his team for working with us on many key issues over the years, notably retirement security for all working Oregonians, corporate governance, and corporate accountability. We at SEIU are committed to engaging the Treasury on climate change and climate justice. The state's pension funds must have a smart, long-term investment strategy to meet its responsibilities to retired workers. The funds must actively manage the risk of climate change and resulting extreme weather, and actively move capital towards a carbon-free economy that will create jobs in every county of the state. We also understand the intersection of climate change and climate justice. We believe that not addressing this concept poses additional risks to our long-term investments. Climate change and climate justice pose a serious risk to our society and our retirement security, yet it does not appear that the Oregon Investment Council is on a path to aggressively address these risks. We look forward to working with Treasurer Read, his team, 350 PDX, and other partners to urge Treasury to take the following steps. Immediately facilitate a climate risk audit to understand the way risk plays out across the Oregon Treasury holdings. Commit to taking all necessary proactive steps to manage the risks the audit identifies. Consider how workers being undervalued and unsafe in the workplace threaten long-term returns. And consider how racist and sexist structures in the finance system threaten the health of our economy. We cannot effectively address climate risk without also addressing these related justice issues if we want to ensure the long-term health of the Treasury's holdings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. We will next hear from Nicole Leto.
Hello, my name is Nicole Leto, and I am a South Coast intern with Rural Climate, here to represent the Coos, Curry, and Douglas counties. My family has been on the Oregon coast for around 16 years. I love the beach environment, and I love the opportunities in our area for hiking. I live in a rural community that has been primarily based on extractive industries such as timber. I also live near the proposed Jordan Cove LNG export terminal facility that showcases how fossil fuel companies tend to focus their development on rural areas. I am very excited to be able to talk with you guys today. I am currently a junior at the North Bend High School. I am interested in studying history and science, as well as being part of the next generation of climate leaders who have to deal with the result of decisions that are currently being made today. As a student, I am impacted by the way how state funds are managed in our school system. The future of classes and programs available to students should be reflective of the clean energy policy work that is currently happening on the federal and state levels. State funds that are invested in fossil fuel stocks should be reinvested in developing education and hands-on programs to help get students more engaged in renewable energy development. We see that solar, wind, and other forms of renewable energy are growing employment industries that can support rural communities. Can we divest from fossil fuels and reinvest into these growing industries? Also, as someone who lives on the Oregon coast, we are facing the frontline impacts of climate change. We do not have the emergency preparedness support to be ready for climate emergencies that may include earthquakes or tsunamis. Last fall, our community became a sanctuary for those who are escaping smoke from wildfires throughout the state. It has become clear that Oregon needs to prioritize how to spend funds and how to invest in a renewable future. Treasurer Read, can you divest state funds from fossil fuels and reinvest into real climate solutions for rural and frontline communities? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nicole. We will next hear from Dr. Theodora Songas. Dr. Songas? Thank you.
Good evening, Treasurer Read. I'm Dr. Theodora Songas, an environmental health scientist specializing in environmental epidemiology. I'm speaking today on behalf of myself and Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'm a public health professional retired from the Oregon Health Division, and I do not want my PERS pension based on investments in coal. I have tried as much as possible to divest my retirement savings from fossil fuels, and it is against my values and principles as a health professional to be benefiting from coal investments that are causing the very health problems I've been fighting during my career in public health. We have known for many years about the adverse health effects of the extraction, transportation, storage, and burning of coal. We've been successful in closing the last coal-fired power plant in Oregon, but it is ironic that the state continues to be rather schizophrenic in its response to the climate emergency by continuing to invest over $100 million of its funds in a known climate disruptor and health hazard. It is way past time to divest from fossil fuels. We know that the adverse effects on health of coal extraction and use as a fuel are not contained within geographic boundaries and are suffered worldwide. But also we need to realize that through the entire life cycle of the process, the people living by are especially impacted. Local communities near mines, transportation routes, storage sites, and export terminals, as well as coal-fired power plants, all suffer the health effects of exposure to coal dust, diesel emissions, airborne particulate matter, heavy metals and other toxics, contamination of air and water, and other impacts on supporting ecosystems. Contamination with coal has adverse effects on all human body systems, including cardiovascular, lung, neurologic, developmental, reproductive, and it contributes to 4 leading causes of death: heart disease, cancer, stroke, and chronic respiratory disease. Young children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions, low-income and BIPOC communities already experiencing health disparities are hit the hardest. To quote Dr. Andy Harris, "Coal is so toxic to our climate and our health that it should be left sequestered in the ground. To promote coal in the 21st century is not just irresponsible, I believe it is immoral." He was speaking for Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility in 2018. We continue to make this statement and request that Treasurer Read make every possible effort to remove investments in coal and all other fossil fuels from our state's investments. We cannot live off of the injustices and harms to others. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Dr. Songas. Lastly, we will hear from Sahara Valentine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Sahara Valentine, and I live in Eugene, Oregon. I'm 16 years old, and I'm with Earth Guardians 350, Sunrise Movement Eugene, and Our Children's Trust. Already last month in Eugene, we were in fire danger. The school year is still a month away from ending, and I'm already worried about the time I will have to spend indoors this summer, not able to leave my air-filtered room. To make matters worse, I was born with asthma, and I was hospitalized for it at a really young age. If you have never experienced an asthma attack before, to put it plainly, it's really, really scary. Smoke from forest fires aggravates my asthma, which makes the fire season an extra difficult time for me. Recently, I've been learning more about how gas appliances affect health. One study found that children in homes with gas stoves have a 42% higher chance of having asthma symptoms, while another in Australia attributed 12% of all childhood asthma burdens to gas stoves. A UCLA study commissioned by the Sierra Club showed that exhaust from gas appliances produces carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide exposures that exceed national and California standards in 90% of all homes modeled. The impact from gas appliances is worse in smaller households, especially smaller apartments, disproportionately harming low-income people. As the Sierra Club put it, the air quality inside nearly every apartment was so bad that it would be illegal if measured outside. Asthma exacerbation is just one of many health issues impacted by climate change. As a young person who experiences this, I can only imagine the effects this crisis will have on the health of coming generations. Oregon has and continues to invest in fossil fuels. Fossil fuel extraction practices and its consumption disproportionately harm low-income and BIPOC communities, especially those in my generation. All youth are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and we will be around to feel the direct impacts of decisions made now. With this in mind, I want to know how you, Treasurer Read, plan to protect my health and my future. What will it take for you to divest Oregon from the fossil fuel industry? As you know, There are many companies and institutions that make sound and prudent investments in clean energy without fossil fuels, and Oregon can do the same. In addition, as I've described, there are risks of investing in fossil fuel companies, as their culpability in aggravating climate change becomes their liabilities. Instead, Oregon can be on the leading edge by helping clean energy companies grow through investment and align values of financial growth with improving the health and well-being of all Oregonians. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sierra, and to all of the speakers from around the state for their perspectives and question for Treasurer Read. It is my pleasure to now introduce Oregon State Treasurer Tobias Read. Tobias Read was elected as Oregon State Treasurer in 2016 after serving a decade in the Oregon House of Representatives. As a member of the Oregon House, he was the chief sponsor of Oregon Saves, which became the first state-sponsored retirement program for workers who lack access to a retirement savings option through their employers. The state treasurer is the state's navigator for sound and responsible financial policy. The treasurer protects the state's credit ratings, sits on the Oregon Investment Council and State Land Board, and oversees public investing, banking, bonding, and financial empowerment programs. Welcome, Treasurer Read, and thank you for listening to our concerns and for making the time to speak with us today.
Thanks very much. I assume someone is going to click on the video. It says, let's see if you can see me now. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Well, I do really want to thank you. Let's see, cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Now maybe you can see me. Let me just say thanks for convening this conversation. It is a really important topic, a really important set of questions, and I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight. I'm also really conscious of the fact that this is a relatively short period of time, given the importance and the complexity of what we need to talk about here. So I don't intend to talk very long because I would much rather get to as many questions as we can. But I do think it's worthwhile for me to spend just a minute setting a little bit of the context and some of the motivation and concerns I bring to this job. A lot of that was reflected in what we heard tonight from speakers. And I'm coming to you from the basement at our house. I've already had a little bit of a victory because our 11-year-old daughter and our 8-year-old son came down, and I convinced them that this was an important topic, and I needed their cooperation for me to participate in it. The concerns for their future is what motivates me to be in this work, and I heard that loud and clear from all of the speakers already tonight. I want to call out specifically Mike Powers, not because what he said was any different necessarily than what others have said, but because hearing his perspective is always a really useful reminder for me, because we invest on behalf of his members and hundreds of thousands of other public employees. And the partnership that we've developed with SEIU, both here in Oregon and nationally, I think really does accrue to the long-term benefit of the state as a whole. And I think we have been really well aligned over my time as treasurer in balancing the risks that people have articulately pointed to, and at the same time avoiding the costly political battles, which are obviously really important. And when I'm not treasurer, not acting in that specific role, I am absolutely with you on the urgency of policymakers to pass laws, to make choices that really accelerate our transition to a clean energy economy. But as investors, what we have really focused on is using the clout that we have, the size of our investment portfolio to leverage and encourage and demand better corporate behavior across the board on issues like climate change, climate disruption, on racial justice, on board diversity, and a whole range of other things. So when and as we consider our strategies and our choices and the way we carry out our duty to the beneficiaries in our plan, it's really important to engage people, especially those who have a direct stake in the choices we make. And I think we are doing some really important things. I appreciated the recognition around our work, hiring our first investment officer whose exclusive focus is on environmental, social, and governance concerns, on remaking our, reframing the lens that we use to screen our proxy votes with a specific ESG lens. The partnerships that we engage in with other institutional investors, and other groups that are organized around specific areas of these concerns. It is frustrating to me how long this takes, because I recognize there's urgency to this. But at the same time, you can also think of this $118 billion portfolio as something of an ocean liner. It takes some time to turn it. And while I am deeply honored and excited to serve as treasurer, I'm not going to get to be treasurer forever. And so another big part of my agenda is to build into the culture of Treasury something that's going to last longer than me. I don't want to do something that would easily snap back or be undone. So we're being diligent, we're being careful, we're being very thorough in how we approach these things so that it builds on itself. It does take time, and that frustrates me. But I can close, I think, with one statistic, and then summarize something again. As much as we want this to be faster, I think there is one really encouraging note I can send to you, which is that in 2019 and 2020, our exposure to fossil fuels decreased, and I'm gonna look down to make sure I have this number right, by approximately 14%. And at the same time, our exposure to renewables increased by about 15%. That is a harbinger of things to come. And I think when you look at the path that I think can reasonably be expected for New York and for Oregon, they are likely to be quite similar over years to come. How we do that is the subject of a lot of energy and a lot of attention from me and from our team. And I want to make sure that we are really well aligned here. I think that the thing that we have to keep in mind as we have the rest of this discussion tonight is that we are on the same team here. We're trying to accelerate our transition, to make sure that Oregon is in a position to contribute to that, and to not suffer the risks that are otherwise in front of us. And I think people on this call generally understand the way we use our investment positions and our decision-making processes to push for better and more sustainable long-term results. It's inherent in how we use risk to address issues like climate, how we vote on shareholder proposals, how we've dramatically expanded the exposure to renewables, just as I said, and how fossil fuels represent a much smaller proportion of the portfolio as we go forward. So I think I want to just say a special thank you to Nicole and Sahara for being such eloquent voices for future generations. That's what we've got to keep in mind as we continue to advance this agenda, not just in the Treasury, but in policy-making arenas throughout Oregon and throughout the country and the world. With that, if it's okay with you, I think I'd like to stop and try to answer as many questions as we can. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Treasurer Read. Now we're moving on to our question and answer portion of the evening. Thank you to those who submitted such thought-provoking and important questions. Rest assured that even if we do not get to your question, the Treasurer's Office will receive your questions and comments via email. The ones we will get to ask are but a fraction of the concerns that were submitted. We will ask as many as time will allow, and since Treasurer Read ended a little bit earlier, we should be able to get to a few more questions. Treasurer Read, please respond as succinctly as possible, since there are so many questions and people who want to talk to you, and we want to cover as many as we can get to. Our first question is from Janet Wheel of Portland. Her question is, the Teachers Pension Fund has assets of $80 billion. Will you commit to divest that fund from fossil fuel corporations and/or financial institutions that support fossil fuel projects and reinvest the funds in projects that protect the climate and the environment? As a retired school teacher, this is important to me.
I appreciate the question. I think it's important to all of us. A couple of quick thoughts. One is that it's a pension fund that covers hundreds of thousands of retirees. Teachers are prominent, certainly, but lots of other people as well. And it is really an important thing to remember that once those dollars are deposited into the pension funds, they're not public dollars anymore. They belong to retirees. And the challenge of investing a portfolio that's this large with as many individual retirees and beneficiaries whose opinions differ is that we have to be focused on what's in their interest. Now, I think the good news is that the long-run interests of beneficiaries aligns with the goals that we have with respect to climate. Another challenge is in how we define what actually includes what is fossil fuel investing. So that's always difficult. I think what we are trying to do on very solid grounds is to make sure that we are accounting for the risk that fossil fuels and other things expose the portfolio to. So we are going to do our very best to minimize risk. Fossil fuels and climate risk are prominent versions of that, and we're going to do our best to seek out opportunities. Renewables are also an example of that, so that the hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries are going to receive the benefits they've earned and be able to pay their rents and buy groceries and all the rest of those things. So the world changes obviously over time, but I think you can be confident that the path for the portfolio going forward is going to be more renewables and less fossil fuels.
Great, thank you, Treasurer Read. We also have a clarification on a question, which is that fossil fuel stock prices have been falling. They make up less they make up less of the market than they did a few years ago. So the question is whether it is a conscious decision to decrease or just reflects the market. Is the OIC consciously trying to divest?
So I'm glad we brought up a couple of things here in this question. One is the nature of the OIC, the Oregon Investment Council. I'm one of 5 members by virtue of being treasurer. There are 4 other members who are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. And there's also an ex officio member who doesn't vote. So the style that we adopt in investing in public equities, that's in an asset class, those are the publicly traded stocks, is one that is much more around index and passive and quantitative strategies. So it's very rare for Treasury staff to be picking individual stocks. That's the style that we've adopted is largely about reducing costs. So there's certainly changes in the market that are playing out in our portfolio, but it also does reflect a deliberate strategy to do a better job of accounting for the risks that are inherent in individual choices and making sure that they are central to our decision-making processes.
Okay. We also have a question from Phil Carver from Salem, and he asks, what fraction of our investments are in fossil fuels and what fraction are in renewable energy, and how have they performed?
Well, it's an important question, and one that is difficult to answer because of those definitions. And I'll give you a really specific example of that. One of the speakers, I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, talked about Portland General Electric and Boardman, at least indirectly. You know, a few years ago when Boardman was operating, you might have an interesting debate about whether Portland General Electric should be counted as a fossil fuel company. If you said yes to that question, it might also be reasonable to question how much of that, you know, how much of the power that PGE generated and delivered was generated from fossil fuel and from Boardman specifically. So does that mean that we count part of Portland General Electric as a fossil fuel company and part not? I raise this only because it's, I think, illustrative of how difficult it is to have a specific answer to that question. On top of that, these change over time. So it's a difficult question to be really specific about. We can certainly follow up and get more specific information to you, Phil. But over time, the exposure to fossil fuels is decreasing. The exposure to renewables is increasing, and I expect that trend is going to continue.
Great. Thanks, Treasurer Read, for bringing up some of the complexities around these issues. We also have a question from Camera Rains from Portland. She asks, in the Cordillera region of the Philippines, indigenous peoples defending their lands and livelihood are under relentless attack by state forces under the command of President Rodrigo Duterte. Chevron is one of the many corporations working with President Duterte and other bad actors in the Philippines to construct energy projects on indigenous ancestral lands, heavily militarizing and displacing entire communities in order to complete these projects. As Portland residents and members of the Anibakian Portland and Kalikasan Solidarity Organization, we are deeply concerned about the role of our state government is playing in perpetuating these grave human rights abuses against innocent civilians in the Philippines by continuing to invest in Chevron. Our question is, why does the Oregon State Treasury invest our money into corporations perpetuating these abuses? And what can you do to stand with the Filipino people against these attacks and divest our state's assets from Chevron?
Thanks for the question. I want to make sure that I acknowledge the seriousness of those issues. Unfortunately, it's not the only place in the world that things like that are occurring, I'm afraid. So we want to use our clout and our shares to highlight that when we can. But it is also really difficult to contemplate changes that are, things can change really rapidly. And if we have to manage over, over decades, and we incur costs for every sort of change that we make, so they have to be really careful. They have to be built for virtually all conditions. And as much and as strongly as we feel about situations like the one described here, we could quickly add up costs and put ourselves in really difficult situations with respect to our obligations to beneficiaries and to the state. So I think we can be more effective when we are shareholders and trying to raise these issues with a corporation and point out the risk that they expose the company to and the future profits that are at risk when they're engaged in bad behavior like this.
Thank you, Treasurer Read. Thank you, Treasurer Read. It sounds like there's a willingness from your office to really take a stand on this issue to Chevron. So we really appreciate your perspective. Annie Schutz from Portland asks, Larry Fink of BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, said on April 20th of this year, climate risk and transition risk is something that's going to impact every portfolio across the board in the coming years. Do you agree?
Absolutely, I agree. There is no question that climate change and transition risk is going to affect every portfolio. In fact, I think we are not doing our fiduciary jobs if we're not accounting for that. That's one of the reasons we are engaged in a climate audit, that we are taking that seriously, that we are doing so much more to integrate those questions into every part of our investment decision-making process.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question now from Martha Nuringer from Forest Grove. She asks, fossil fuel investment returns are steadily declining. So how is it not fiduciary malfeasance to continue making such investments?
Well, I think, Martha, it's a good question. One of the challenges of looking at any piece of data in isolation is that it can potentially be misleading. And this is an observation I make not specific to the conversation we're having here tonight, but frequently as treasurer, I'm asked, what is the impact of X on the portfolio, or what is the value of Y part of the portfolio? And I'm tempted sometimes to respond with, you mean right now or right now? Because it's changing all the time. And so you can pick probably any time period to generate a result that supports your position. Now, I have no problem with the conclusion that over time, we are going to need to reduce our exposure to fossil fuels, increase our exposure to renewables. I think that's true both because of the risk that we avoid by moving away from fossil fuels, and because of the opportunity that exists by moving towards renewables. Sometimes it's not that simple either, because of a given company might have a mix of both, and they might be transitioning away from fossil fuels, and they might be the innovator on the technology or an approach that's going to make it much easier for us to transition. So all of these things play out in different ways that don't always get reflected when you see a single line or a few lines on a graph. So I can tell you that we are committed to making sure that the risks are accurately reflected in our decision making, and that we are continuing to make decisions for the long run benefit of our beneficiaries.
Thank you so much. We also have a question from Cheryl Conway from Astoria, and that is, how can Oregon state pension participants affect the ways their money is invested?
That's also a good question. We are happy to hear from people. Our obligation is to interact with the places that we, the managers that we interact with, the companies where we invest. That's why we file shareholder resolutions, like the one that Mr. Powers referenced earlier on. We're eager to hear from people. The Oregon Investment Council meetings are public. We have a public comment period near the end of every agenda, so people can express their opinions, and we're always happy to hear from people.
Great, thank you very much. And it seems like a kind of a repetitive question, and I'm hoping that we can, Treasurer Read, I hope that this doesn't get redundant. Lynn Bajarak from Portland asks, what is keeping Oregon from divesting from fossil fuels?
Well, our obligations and the complexity and how we our style and the constraints, frankly. And it's also, a lack of, I think, consensus on what exactly that means. There is, I refer again to that example of Portland General Electric in our backyard. When there's a company that is making that transition, that's moving away from coal in the case of PGE, committing to closing down Boardman, committing to dramatic increases in the proportion of their energy load that comes from renewable sources. Does that count or does that not count? And how do we balance our need to reduce costs and generate returns over the long run with concerns legitimate that that can change on a much more rapid basis. All those timeframes can not line up all the time. And if the other key element that I think everyone here acknowledges is that if we do divest, we give up our voice, our ability to vote our shares and hold corporations accountable for bad behavior. So I think it's a variety of answers to that question, but I also respectfully suggest that it is not a binary choice. We've talked at some length tonight, thankfully, about the other ways that we're trying to have an impact on our transition to a clean economy. Shareholder resolutions, decisions, building things into our processes that don't think of this as an all or nothing decision. Okay,
great. Thank you very much. And Nathan Carmen from Portland is asking, and we just have a couple of minutes remaining from our panel presentation. And he asks, does the presence of a Northwest Natural Board member on the Oregon Investment Council impact your decision making?
It certainly doesn't impact mine. I think that, I guess I should slow that down a little bit. It might be a positive in some ways, I suppose, if I'm hearing different perspectives, but there's nothing in my experience that is specific to that presence. I think our board members bring a wealth of experience, a diversity of perspectives, and put us in a good position to have a real robust decision-making process. So I'd say no.
Okay, terrific. This question, I think, is our last question, and I'm hoping that it can become the beginning of a rich conversation, which is how do you, Kathy Moyd from Portland asks, how do you determine what position to take on shareholder motions?
Good question. So there are so many shareholder resolutions that we could not give them all the attention they deserve based on our capacity at Treasury. So we engage with a consultant who provides recommendations. And in this case, it's a little bit like entering the ice cream store, and you can decide which flavor you want. We went through a process a couple of years ago and decided quite deliberately, after a lot of careful consideration, that we wanted to apply an ESG lens. We picked the ESG flavor that Glass Lewis offers. And so they provide their recommendations, and we can depart from those recommendations when justified. And I've done that on various occasions. But I'm happy to say that most of the time, the Glass Lewis recommendations line up with my judgment about what's appropriate over the long run, and is helping to facilitate good decisions with respect to ESG concerns.
Great. Well, with just a minute left at the top of the hour, we want to thank Treasurer Tobias Read for listening to our concerns about the climate crisis and speaking with us about how he can leverage his power for this important issue. We also want to thank all of you for taking the time to make this topic a priority and learning more. We will touch base with you to request feedback about the event and your interest in forming a concerted group addressing the issues we discussed today. We would love to hear from you. Again, thank you so much to all of our co-sponsors and for partnering with us for this event. We hope.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to just say thank you as well, particularly for your tolerance of the addition of my family. Briefly, you probably heard and maybe saw them. It's a dose of reality here, so I appreciate that. I appreciate the conversation, and particularly this connection between the kids at our house and the young people who are part of this conversation tonight. It's a really good reminder, and I feel really well aligned with the aspirations and ambitions of this group. So I'm looking forward to continuing to stay in touch. Sorry for the interruption. I just was afraid you were going to say goodbye before I got to say something like that.
Well, thank you so much. And just for making that connection between just the fact that you care about your children's future and the future of all young people and our planet. We hope that you all learned something new and got a better sense of the voices across the state committed to the stewardship of public funds that reflects community concerns and values. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good night.